Hi, my name is Mike McKeen. My company is Twin Cities Backup, and today this discussion is every business must have in place now to guarantee a fast, easy, and painless recovery of their data after a disaster. I will tell you that the short version of this, we call this backups and beer. Unfortunately, there's no beer in the room for right now, but there's a bar next door if you want to talk about that later. So the last time we did this presentation was Harriet Brewing, and instead of doctoring the slides, I left those in there, so that'll be kind of fun to see. We're a small Twin Cities business. We've been started servicing our clients in '99. We've been acting as 010 Innovation since 2006, but in 2013 we started Twin Cities Backup. With Twin Cities Backup, it's designed specifically to protect your business. Adam, my partner on the right, my right, the reason that picture's in there is because we know a little bit about protecting businesses. It's more than just backing up your data. He is a part-time firefighter and knows some of the after effects of what happens when things get lost in a disaster. And this picture on my left is me and my wife at a 60s Polish wedding birthday party. So if you want a strange, fun theme, that's an idea for your next birthday party. Just a quick testimonial there. We're a part of a bunch of different groups. I'm going to kind of breeze through a lot of these pages because this presentation was set for a longer period of time. So we're going to go the difference between disaster recovery, business continuity, and backups, the types of disasters, why you should be afraid. This isn't necessarily meant to scare you, but at the same time, sometimes that's what we need in order to act on something. How to ensure that your data is not lost, and how to put your backup on autopilot. So the whole goal of doing backups is to make sure you never lose the critical data. And that's very important to distinguish, because if you have, let's say, a bunch of tax forms, why do we need to back up that type of information? We don't, because we can go to the IRS website or we can go to any government website and download these same forms. So it's very important that we're making sure that we're backing up the critical pieces of our business. Obviously, we want to minimize downtime. Minimizing downtime has a lot of soft costs that people don't necessarily think about. That downtime can mean, I'll give you an example. We have a client that was in the process of converting all their paper documents into digital. So they were scanning all this stuff in, and they had several employees that were doing this process, and each employee, let's say they had an average of $20 an hour. Well, in their case, the agreement with them was we would come out once a quarter and look at their backups and make sure everything was on pace. Well, literally 2 days before, we were out there and there was a problem with the backup. So we're in the process of fixing it. It's not just make a couple check boxes enabled and we're backing up and running. You got to make the changes, run the backup, and then make sure you can recover that information. Well, while we're in the process of repairing this, they lost the disk drive that all of these scanned images were on. So everything that they had done to this point for this document imaging process was completely lost. So when you're talking about minimizing downtime, that is a poor use of that situation, because now all of those hours for multiple people that they've put in, they have to redo all of that. At the same time, we want to make sure that when you are up and running, that you stay up and running and you're productive. If a server goes down or something like that, we want that back up and going as fast as possible. You can think of a whole lot of reasons why this is important, but the thing that's important for small businesses is that right away, 25 to 43% never reopen. 51% of small businesses, when they encounter a disaster, close within 2 years of the loss. Only 6% survive past the 5-year mark. So if you're a small business, doing these sorts of backups, if you want to maintain your business tomorrow after a disaster, it's very important to make sure you have a plan today up front. This slide's kind of interesting because from a small business standpoint, we make up more than 99% of the companies that have employees in them. Half of them are all private sectors, and nearly 45% of the nation's payroll are small businesses. So the folks that are in the room with you are very important to the economy. You got to make a commitment to plan, and you have to have the plan in place for not only yourself, but for your employees and your clients, and how to deal with that. Business continuity, business resumption. I'm not going to read this because it's a huge mouthful to basically say, how are you going to get your business up and going after you have a disaster? How do you keep running your business even though you've lost everything? Basically, it's the process that needs to happen on a day-to-day basis to allow the business to operate and survive. It's not just about the IT issues, and this is the biggest thing when we're talking to clients. Because we're an IT company, they think that, oh, well, we just need to talk to you about technology. But there's way more than technology that's involved in that. Having a plan and having a list of phone numbers, that old calling tree that you used to have, that's still just as important. I was just meeting with a client this morning that said, do we have your phone number written down? And they had an internal discussion about if they knew how to contact us in case their building did go up in flames. So it's way more than just the technology piece. You need to have those correct contact information. It's not just IT. You need to have your insurance information. You need to be able to contact your attorney. You need to be able to, and depending on your industry, you may need to be able to, you might be forced to notify all of your clients about this loss. There's all kinds of potential for loss. What we see most of the time, human errors is huge. How many times or how many of you have ever saved over a document and said, oh crap, right? You spent hours working on this, or how many of you have spent hours on working on something and your computer crashed and you hadn't saved it all during those hours that you were typing that stuff up? So human errors, that's really big. Part of that is education, but at the same time, a human error also is a low loss on your on the recovery perspective. When you're talking about things like fires, environmental hazards, terrorism, stuff like that, that's a lot bigger deal. Terrorism, that's today with the denial of service with Meetup, that's kind of a form of terrorism. Third-party failures, a lot of times these problems that we run into are not necessarily yours specifically. How many of you have had your internet service go down? It's an example of third-party failures. So it's more than just the technology that you own and have purchased. Equipment failures, this is very important to know. Expect this type of failure at some point. Technology is not designed to last, and as we've gotten further and further along, technology the lifespan is getting shorter and shorter, unfortunately. Companies that make these devices make money off of selling these devices. So if they make a device that is going to run for 100 years, they're not going to sell too many of those, right? Or they'll kind of hit a plateau and not be able to turn those over. So a lot of devices are becoming replaceable, and part of that is the cost has gone down. So because the cost is going down, we're able to turn those over a little bit quickly. But you need to plan on these types of failures because they're going to happen. Denial of access due to smoke, irritants, fresh paint. How many of you have been in an office building and as you're walking through the building, you're smelling the paint fumes from the guy next door that's doing a build out? There are people that are susceptible to that, and they can't work in that environment. So there's a lot more to making sure that your data is protected. It's making sure your people are protected as well. Fires and other disasters. Other times that I've given this presentation, Adam's been here and he stepped in and he's told some really funny stories about, they're not funny because there's somebody with a fire, but at the same time, talking to some of the folks and how they've had to do recoveries and how they didn't have plans, and he's a better looking firefighter than me, so I'm just going to keep going on that one. Here's Pat's problem today. There were people trying to sabotage meetup.com, so registrations were down. This is a picture of our office building in Edina. We're a small office in this building, but it's important to be aware of your surroundings as well. A couple blocks or a couple buildings down from us is Seagate, a manufacturing facility. That needs to be taken into account for environmental issues that could possibly dealing with our building. Or this is a nice summertime picture, but you got to imagine that right now this parking lot certainly doesn't look like that. It's a little bit wider than this. And I got to be honest with you that this parking lot doesn't get cleaned as well as it is. So sometimes you can't get into the office. You need to be able to be prepared for things like that. Where to start when you find these is a vulnerability assessment. Start listing out the different threats that could happen to your business: tornado, fire, water, flood. Depending on your area, a great example is my home. I literally moved around the corner from my house. It was less than 200 yards away from one house to the next. But in those 200 yards, the floodplain had changed. So in my first house, I was required to have flood insurance, but in my second house, I wasn't. So it's very important that your geography is taken into consideration when you are looking at protecting your business. Disaster recovery. So we talked about business continuity. We want to keep the business up and going even when there is a disaster. So disaster recovery essentially is being able to get back up and running and recover all of that data. But when you're recovering that, there's a policy and there's a procedure in order to get back to that. How do you get back up and running? Who do we contact? How do we recover this data? And what are the steps that are needed? And what is the order that we need to do those? And each disaster obviously is different. The probability of each occurrence. The probability of a hurricane in Minnesota is pretty small, I think you'd all agree. However, the probability of a tornado is pretty big. Northeast Minneapolis got hit with one. Plymouth has gotten hit with a tornado. Those are things that we need to be prepared for. When we talk about flood, I had a client call me one time and she said, "Hey Mike, can you back up my data real quick?" And I was like, "Well, hold on a second. First of all, can I get to your server?" So I log in there. "Yes, I can get to your server. What do you want me to back up?" "Well, everything." "All right, well, hold on. Why are you calling me and why are you asking me this question?" Well, come to find out, somewhere else in the building, the water started leaking. And from that, the sprinklers started going off. So she said, "My server below it has 2 inches of water, and I'm going to need to make sure that data is backed up." And I said, "Get out of the building. This is not a time to be talking about the backups. We should have been talking about that before this started flooding, started raining on your server." We need to make sure that that is something that's very probable as a possibility compared to like a hurricane for any environment, especially here in the Midwest. This is the table I was talking about. So when I had mentioned human errors, the chance of a human being part of the problem when data is lost is very probable, but the impact on that is very low. We have software that can monitor and back up that data as soon as it's saved. So if you save it, now we've got a copy. And if you save multiple times during the day, we've got multiple copies of that same data. So the impact on that's pretty small. However, if we run into things like a fire or terrorism and sabotage, the probability is a lot less, right? I mean, hopefully none of you have been in a fire, but even if you have been, what's the probability of hitting twice or 3 times, something like that? The probability of it hitting the first time is pretty small, but hitting again is even smaller. So the probability is high, and the impact actually is vastly different. Because in this case, Mike saved over the top of his Excel spreadsheet that affected just me and my report that I need, my TPS report that I need to give to the manager, right? But when we're talking about fires and sabotage and stuff like that, that affects the whole business. Everything's down. So now not only do I have Mike that's out a couple hours of work, but in this case I got 20, 30, 40 employees depending on the size of your business, and they're all out. And some of these folks are on salary. You're still paying them to be there even though they're not doing any work. So the impact is much greater when you have that type of vulnerability. 2 concepts that are very important when we're talking about backups and disaster recovery are the recovery time objective and the recovery point objective. These are very important for every business. The recovery time objective is how long your business can survive before you have to be operational to remain in business. I'll give you an example. We had a company in Bloomington, this was a couple years ago, probably 4 or 5 now at this point, that there was power outages, and called them on Monday. They were down. "Hey, we can get you back up and going." "Nah, don't worry about it. It's only 1 day." So I called them on Tuesday. They were still down. hey, we can still get you back up and going. I know that you don't have any power at your office, but we got a partnership with a company. We can move you in there. No problem. They were down for a whole week. How many of you can be down for a whole week without doing any business and not have that be an impact on your business? Nobody's raising their hand. That's very difficult to do. So how long your business can be down is very important to what backup strategy you use in order to protect yourself. The other one is the recovery point objective. How old can your data be and still have value? We have clients that sell financial services. They can't remove any data related to a specific client of theirs until that person moves to another financial service company or dies. So I'm relatively young, and I'm going to be a financial service client hopefully for many more years. So the company that I'm working with, they need to have every information, all that communication with me for all these years to come. So we need to be able to hold on to that data for a very long time. At the same time, I would say our average client, we have about a 2-week retention period. So if they delete a file today, after 2 weeks, that file is going to be gone. We're not going to be able to recover that. So it's the recovery point objective is very important to discuss when you're determining what your backup strategy is. And both of these, the time objective and the recovery point objective, certainly have its different values, right? It's going to cost you more for me to be able to pull data from 5 minutes ago than it would be to pull it from 2 weeks ago. Or in some cases, maybe it's going to cost more to pull it from 5 years ago than it will be from 5 minutes ago. More importantly is your recovery time objective. I do have clients that say, if I lose data, it's the afternoon now, it's after lunch, I lost, a whole network's down. We need to be able to recover all of the data from the things that we did this morning. That's going to be a higher cost to your business than to say, well, I can have that data. If you can get that data back to me in a few days, that's fine. Well, now I've got a little bit of time to recover, and now we got a couple days to put into this. So your recovery time objective also affects your costs going into this. And of course, it determines, depending on the disaster, how that goes too. On your backups, the biggest thing that I want to point on this slide is that you have on-site and off-site backups. Just doing a backup on-site is not good enough. Because if something happens to that building, we've all lived through 9/11 and know that that's a very real possibility. Having all that data in one place is not good enough. We need to have another copy of that off-site. Traditional backup methodology, we do a backup each night. A lot of times we're relying on staff to make sure that backup is working. How many of you are slow and don't have enough to do? We're all busy. And we want to make sure that these backups still happen even though we're busy. Kind of give you an idea on that. Relies on your staff to make sure that the backup is working, okay? We went into a client and we did an assessment on them, and this guy was religiously changing out his tapes every day. That was part of his job. He knew that we need to get the tapes working, we need to make sure we had a good backup. The problem is that even though he was switching out the backup tape, he wasn't making sure the backup was working. This particular gentleman hadn't had a backup in 6 months, even though every business day he has switched out that tape. So it's more than just making sure that your backup is being backed up, but you have to do a recovery process on that and make sure you can get that data back. Tape backups are slow, they take a long time, and again, we're relying on people. What companies are doing now is they're starting to move to disk backups, because going from one disk to another is a lot faster than a tape. And generally speaking, with the disk, we're not switching out those tapes every day. Here's the problem. Any old backup is good enough. How many of you all have a backup? Okay, that's good. There were some hands raised there, but any old backup is not good enough. You want to make sure that you can get intraday backups. For that client that needs to, say, recover data from in the morning, we need to be able to recover that in the afternoon. We don't want to impact day-to-day operations in case something does go down. If your data is going off-site, how is it going off-site? We want to make sure it's secure, and if you're using a cloud service, you want to make sure that data is secure before it leaves your office. Anything that you do on the internet is public and scary, right? And if we have our own client data in there, we want to make sure that that's secure. So when it leaves my office, I want to make sure it's secure before it leaves my office. And then whoever my cloud provider is, I want to make sure that in a lot of cases that they don't even have access to it. There are vendors that out there that have syncing software. So you have a folder on your desktop, and when you save it in that folder, it gets copied out to the cloud. Some of those providers have access to that data. Even though it's your data in your account, they can still get it. If they're given a court order, they can go get your data and provide it to somebody else. Well, that's kind of a scary thing. We want to make sure that all that data is secure. This is the biggest thing. Can your business survive if you go through some sort of disaster? So start thinking about some of those disasters that you've encountered or that could be possible for your business, whether you're a home business or you have an office, share an office or what have you. You want to make sure that your business can still survive in the event that something bad does happen. The whole point is that I want you guys to be aware that we want to make sure that you and your business are still running in the event of any sort of disaster. Make sure you're testing it. Create your plan today. Make sure you have something in place before you lose that data. Backups and disaster recovery are not the same. Backing up your data and being able to recover everything are two different processes, but both of them are equally as important. If you have any questions, be happy to talk to you afterwards. Yes, sir.
So, Mike, do you encrypt the data as part of Twin Cities backup,
Absolutely.
both in terms of sending at rest and then restoration?
Yeah, matter of fact, the product that we use is good for single consumer to, we could sell it to 3M or Wholemail or whatever the large business is. I was sending text messages back and forth with my brother yesterday, and he was giving me a hard time about my geek speak. And because part of my geek speak was your data's in this folder external to your computer in an encrypted fashion, and it's compressed, and his eyes started glossing over at that point. But yes, absolutely, that data is encrypted, so only you with the password have access to that, regardless if it's a local backup, whether that backup is transferred over the internet or stored at a cloud provider. So absolutely. Yes, sir.
Can you talk about some of the pitfalls of cloud services?
Specifically as it relates to data storage, yeah, the one that I'll give you, the biggest one is the file syncing services. There's a number of them that are out there now. There's one in particular that is a kind of a household name, kind of like Kleenex now. But the biggest pitfall with that is that if you don't ensure that that information is encrypted and that you're the only one that has access with a password to get that information, then it's susceptible to attack or loss. In some cases, in this particular provider that I'm thinking of, your average Joe's not going to get it. You know, I couldn't get access to your information in that regard, but the company that houses that, being that it's stored in the cloud, they could get access to that information. And if they're presented with a court order, they have to give that information. So if you have things like your social security number, any of your medical information, or any of that type of stuff for your clients, having that in your cloud provider in an unencrypted fashion is a big no-no. So in those regards, what we tell people to do is there's a bunch of different software out there specifically designed for encrypting that information. So you can encrypt that information and then put it in the folder. So if a judge says, hey, we need to recover this information, they're going to recover an encrypted file that, again, only you have access to. So you just have to be very careful. When you're putting it in the cloud, make sure that whatever provider that you're using is telling you that this data is encrypted. They're showing you the level of encryption, and make sure that you're setting the password. Because if you're not setting the password, an encryption password, and I want to be clear about that, because if I go log on to Yahoo or Gmail or Amazon Web Services or what have you, that's an account to log into the server, not necessarily to my data. You need a separate password for your encryption. And generally those encryption passwords need to be really long, like 20 characters and longer. So unless you're setting that information, assume that somebody could get that information. Then it doesn't matter what provider that you're working with on that. Yes, sir.
So just to follow up on that, is there also an assumption, or can we make an assumption that when you're using a free cloud-based service like a Google service, that they're going to use that data for data mining of their own purpose?
Yeah, there's actually a website, scroogled.com, and that's specifically what it is. It's your information. In this case, it's email, and it's hosted on their servers, but absolutely. It may not be a person that's looking at your specific data, but because it's hosted on their service and it's not in an encrypted fashion, they can use systems to browse that information. And by all means, in Gmail specifically, there's ads that come across the top, and those ads are based on what your email content is.
Do they do the same for data that you store on the cloud through their service?
There's not as many ads when it comes to like Google Drive, but at the same time, it's not. There's nothing to stop them, and there's no encrypted piece of that. So your data is not encrypted out there, so with the right access, then they certainly could get that information. There's a couple other presenters, so I'll let them, but if you guys have any other questions, feel free to grab me afterwards. Thank you.